Now that Richard is gone, we can finally turn this place into something modern, my daughter-in-law whispered to a caterer less than an hour after my husband's funeral ended. I heard every word from the top of the staircase, one hand resting against the polished walnut banister my husband had installed himself 32 years earlier. For a moment, I simply stood there in silence, looking down at the woman wearing a fitted black dress and pearl earrings I had once given her for Christmas. Vanessa smiled politely as guests moved around her carrying empty champagne glasses and folded sympathy cards, but there was no grief in her face. Only relief. Only calculation. I should have been shocked, but grief has a strange way of sharpening certain truths. When you lose the person who sat beside you every morning for 40 years, the noise of the world disappears, and suddenly you begin hearing things people thought they were clever enough to hide. Richard Harper had been dead for exactly 9 hours, and already my daughter-in-law was discussing renovations to my home. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't walk downstairs and remind her that the house legally belonged to me. I didn't mention the trust worth $28 million that my husband had quietly placed under my control 6 months earlier. Instead, I adjusted the sleeve of my black cashmere sweater and continued listening from the shadows like a woman attending her own funeral. The kitchen definitely needs to be opened up, Vanessa said softly, swirling the last sip of white wine in her glass. Richard liked everything dark and traditional, but Daniel and I want something brighter. Cleaner. Younger. Younger. The word lingered in the air longer than the scent of lilies surrounding Richard's framed photograph in the foyer downstairs. I looked toward that photograph now. My husband's silver hair neatly combed, his blue eyes warm and familiar beneath the Connecticut autumn sunlight captured forever in that picture from Nantucket 3 summers ago. Richard always hated photographs, but I had insisted that day. One day, I told him jokingly, "I'll want proof you were handsome." I still remembered the sound of his laugh. Low, calm, steady enough to quiet every room he entered. The house no longer sounded like him. It sounded like whispers, polite voices, shoes against marble floors, crystal glasses clinking softly while people discussed stock markets and golf. Memberships between condolences. Wealthy people have a remarkable ability to make grief look elegant. The funeral reception had ended nearly an hour ago, but several guests still lingered downstairs pretending concern while quietly measuring the future value of a dead man's estate. And Vanessa was thriving in it. She moved through the crowd like the new queen of the Harper family, one manicured hand resting possessively against Daniel's arm every time someone approached them. My son looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, 41 years old, and somehow still incapable of standing upright without leaning emotionally on whoever spoke loudest near him. Once upon a time, Daniel had been gentle, sensitive, the kind of little boy who used to leave handwritten birthday cards on my pillow every year. But somewhere between law school, corporate dinners, and 12 years of marriage to Vanessa Sinclair, my son had slowly disappeared into the background of his own life. Vanessa spoke for him now. Vanessa decided things now. Vanessa interpreted silence as weakness and kindness as permission. I descended the staircase slowly, smoothing my hand against the banister as guests turned politely toward me. A few offered sympathetic smiles. Someone touched my arm gently. Another woman told me Richard had been such a powerful presence. I thanked them all with the detached calm of someone surviving by instinct alone. Vanessa spotted me immediately. Her expression shifted so quickly it almost impressed me. Concern replaced ambition in less than a second. "Evelyn," she said softly, walking toward me with open arms. "You should be resting. Today has been overwhelming for you." Overwhelming. Such a delicate word for the moment your entire life collapses inward like wet paper. "I'm all right," I replied quietly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Vanessa squeezed my hands with practiced tenderness. "Daniel and I were just talking about how important it is that you don't go through this alone." Of course they were. Daniel stepped closer beside her, his tie loosened slightly beneath the collar of his white dress shirt. "Mom," he said gently, "maybe you should think about staying somewhere smaller for a while. Just until things settle down." There it was. Not even 12 hours. I looked at my son carefully, searching for hesitation in his face, but all I found was discomfort. Not guilt. Not cruelty. Just the exhausted discomfort of a man trying to avoid conflict by surrendering before it begins. "Smaller," I repeated softly. Vanessa smiled sympathetically. This house is enormous, Evelyn. Nearly 11,000 square feet. It's too much responsibility now, especially after everything you've been through. I almost admired the precision of her timing. She spoke as if she were recommending a spa retreat, instead of quietly removing a widow from the home she helped build over 3 decades. We were thinking maybe a luxury retirement community, she continued gently. Somewhere with staff and activities, and people your own age. People your own age. I glanced around the room slowly. Half the guests downstairs were older than me. Men who still chaired investment firms. Women who still sat on museum boards and charity foundations. Age only becomes an insult when younger people want something you own. That's thoughtful, I said calmly. Vanessa relaxed slightly, mistaking composure for surrender. Richard used to warn me about that habit of hers. Never underestimate a patient woman, Evelyn, he'd once said quietly while we sat together on the back terrace late one summer evening. Especially one who has already decided she's won. I hadn't understood at the time how carefully he'd been observing our family. But Richard noticed everything. The subtle comments Vanessa made whenever expensive topics arose. The way she asked about account structures over holiday dinners. The strange urgency she showed anytime legal paperwork entered conversation. 6 months earlier, after one particularly tense Christmas gathering, Richard had closed the study door behind us and handed me a thick leather folder. If something happens to me, he said quietly, promise me you won't tell them everything right away. I remembered staring at him across the amber glow of his desk lamp, irritation rising in my chest. Richard, stop talking like that. But he had only smiled sadly and pushed the folder toward me. Trust documents. Account structures. Property holdings. $28 million placed entirely under my authority through a protected family trust none of them knew existed. Why would you hide this from Daniel? I'd asked softly. Richard leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking older than I had ever allowed myself to notice. Because Daniel still thinks love and loyalty are the same thing, he said quietly. And Vanessa knows they aren't. Downstairs, someone laughed near the dining room. Vanessa glanced briefly toward the sound before lowering her voice again. Of course there's no rush, she assured me sweetly. We just want what's best for you. The chandelier light reflected softly against the diamond bracelet wrapped around her wrist. Richard had bought her that bracelet himself 10 years ago after she cried at Thanksgiving about feeling unwelcome in the family. He always tried to make peace, even with people who viewed kindness as a weakness to exploit. I appreciate your concern, I replied calmly. Then I looked directly at Daniel. But your father made arrangements before he passed away. Vanessa's eyes sharpened almost instantly. There it was. Not grief. Not compassion. Interest. Arrangements, she repeated carefully. I held her gaze for one long second before offering the smallest smile. Nothing you need to worry about tonight. That answer unsettled her more than anger ever could have. I watched the uncertainty flicker across her face before she quickly recovered her polished composure. But for the first time all evening, Vanessa Sinclair Harper no longer looked entirely certain of herself. And upstairs, locked safely inside Richard's old study, sat a leather folder containing the one thing my daughter-in-law never expected me to possess. Power. The house became unbearably quiet after everyone finally left. Silence settled into the walls the same way dust settles over forgotten furniture, slowly and heavily, until every room felt abandoned. I stood alone in the foyer long after the last black sedan disappeared down the circular driveway, staring at the flower arrangements crowding the entrance hall. White lilies, white roses, white orchids flown in from California because Vanessa insisted people of our status expected elegance. Thousands of dollars in flowers, and yet the house still smelled like grief. I removed my heels beside the staircase and carried them upstairs myself. Margaret, our housekeeper of 23 years, offered to help, but I told her she should go home early. Her eyes lingered on me with concern before she quietly gathered her coat and left through the kitchen entrance. Even she seemed uneasy tonight. People notice tension long before families admit it exists. Upstairs, the master bedroom looked exactly as Richard had left it 3 days earlier before his final trip to the hospital. His reading glasses still rested beside the leather-bound biography on his nightstand. One navy blue cashmere sweater remained folded carefully across the chair near the windows overlooking the back gardens. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked softly through the darkness, each second sounding louder. Then the last, I sat slowly on the edge of our bed and pressed my hand against the comforter beside me. Cold. Empty. 40 years of marriage reduced to silence and folded fabric. Earlier that afternoon, during the reception downstairs, several women had hugged me tightly and whispered variations of the same sentence into my ear. Richard adored you. As though love becomes easier to summarize once someone dies. But love was never simple inside this house. It was morning coffee waiting beside my newspaper before I even came downstairs. It was Richard warming my car during snowstorms because he worried about icy roads. It was arguments over paint colors. Quiet apologies. Shared routines repeated so many times they became invisible. And toward the end, love became worry. I could see that clearly now. Richard had been watching our family unravel for much longer than I realized. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and removed the small velvet jewelry box hidden beneath old letters and reading glasses. Inside sat the key Richard handed me 6 months earlier. Brass. Plain. Ordinary looking. The key to the locked filing cabinet inside his study. The same cabinet Vanessa casually tried opening twice during Christmas dinner while pretending to search for extra candles. I remember noticing it then, but dismissing the feeling in my stomach as paranoia. Women my age are trained to doubt our instincts. We are taught to call intuition anxiety and manipulation misunderstanding. But Richard never dismissed what he saw. She keeps inventory every time she walks into this house, he told me one night after Vanessa left early from Easter brunch. Inventory. I had laughed softly at the time. Richard folded his newspaper carefully before answering. She notices watches. Art. Paintings. Silverware. Account discussions. She watches wealth the way some people watch weather patterns. I defended her back then. Of course I did. Because mothers spend most of their lives trying to protect their sons from disappointment, even when disappointment is sitting directly across the dinner table wearing designer heels. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I could answer, the bedroom door opened slightly and Daniel stepped inside. He looked exhausted. His dark blonde hair was disheveled, and deep shadows rested beneath his eyes. For a brief moment, seeing him standing there in the doorway hurt more than Richard's empty side of the bed. Because I suddenly remembered. The little boy who used to crawl into this room after nightmares carrying a stuffed dinosaur beneath one arm. Mom, he asked quietly, can I come in? You never needed permission before, I replied softly. He attempted a weak smile before stepping farther into the room. His eyes moved briefly toward Richard's side of the bed, then away again almost immediately. Avoidance. That had become Daniel's survival mechanism over the years. If he looked directly at painful things, he might be forced to confront them honestly. Vanessa went home to change, he said. She wanted me to check on you. I nodded slowly, though we both understood Vanessa was not worried about my emotional well-being. She was worried about timing. Timing of legal meetings. Timing of account transfers. Timing of property discussions. Death transforms certain people into project managers. Daniel lowered himself carefully into the armchair near the fireplace. You should probably try to sleep, he said quietly. You have had a long day. So have you. He rubbed his hands together slowly. Nervous habit. Richard did the same thing whenever he prepared to discuss uncomfortable business decisions. Mom, Daniel began carefully. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe it would help if we stayed here for a while. There it was again. Another gentle suggestion wrapped in concern. Stayed here. I repeated. Just temporarily, he explained quickly. At least until everything settles. The estate matters. The house staff. There are so many things to organize. Organize. Such an efficient word. My eyes drifted toward the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Richard stood in the center with one arm around my shoulders. Daniel beside us, smiling naturally before adulthood taught him caution. Vanessa stood perfectly poised at the edge of the frame, beautiful and controlled even then. She always looked camera-ready. Even at funerals. Your father handled most things himself, I said quietly. There is not much to organize. Daniel hesitated. Actually, Vanessa mentioned there are probably legal details we should start reviewing soon. Of course she had. The man was barely buried. I see. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Mom, I know this is difficult, but you should not have to deal with all this alone. Dad had a complicated financial portfolio. Complicated. I almost smiled at that. Daniel still believed his father kept him involved in everything. He had no idea how many conversations Richard and I shared privately during those final months. Conversations after midnight while the rest of the house slept. Conversations filled with quiet disappointment and painful realizations. Did Dad ever mention updates to the trust? Daniel asked carefully. There was at last. Not grief. Not memories. Not his father's favorite song or the watch he wore every day for 30 years. Trusts. Legal structures. Assets. I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. Why would you ask that? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. No reason. Vanessa just thought there might be paperwork requiring signatures. Signatures. The room suddenly felt colder. Richard predicted this almost word for word during our final week together. We had been sitting beside the hospital window while snow drifted softly across the parking lot below. Machines beeped steadily behind him, though he barely seemed to notice anymore. Illness strips life down to essentials very quickly. Promise me something, he whispered quietly that night. I reached for his hand immediately. Anything. Do not rush to rescue them from their own behavior. I frowned at him. Richard. But he squeezed my hand weakly before continuing. I spent years giving Daniel excuses because I wanted to believe kindness naturally creates loyalty. It does not. Sometimes kindness simply creates entitlement. Back in the bedroom, Daniel stood slowly from the armchair. You should get some rest, he said again. I nodded politely. He moved toward the door, then paused. Mom. Yes. He hesitated just long enough for guilt to appear briefly in his expression. Dad loved you very much. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Because unlike everything else tonight, that part was true. I know, I whispered. Daniel gave a small nod and disappeared into the hallway. A few seconds later, I heard his footsteps retreat down the staircase toward the first floor where Vanessa was probably already waiting inside the kitchen reviewing guest lists, property taxes, and timelines. I remained seated on the bed long after the house became quiet again. Then slowly, carefully, I opened the velvet box in my lap and stared down at the brass key resting inside. Downstairs, somewhere beyond the silence of the empty estate, I heard Vanessa laugh softly. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Richard's voice echoing through the silence of the bedroom, calm and patient the way it always sounded whenever he was trying to prepare me for something difficult. Around 4 a.m, rain began tapping softly against the windows overlooking the back gardens. Connecticut rain in late October always carried a certain heaviness to it. Cold, gray, endless. I wrapped myself in Richard's navy cashmere sweater and walked barefoot downstairs toward the kitchen. The marble floors felt colder than usual beneath my feet. The house no longer felt lived in. It felt observed. Halfway down the staircase, I noticed lights spilling from beneath the study door at the end of the hallway. I stopped immediately. Richard's study had always remained locked after 10 o'clock at night. That was one of his rules. Business belongs behind closed doors, he used to say whenever Daniel wandered inside asking questions about investments or contracts. But now, at 4 a.m, someone was inside. Quietly, I continued down the staircase without making a sound. The closer I moved toward the hallway, the clearer the voices became. Vanessa and Daniel. There has to be another key somewhere, Vanessa whispered sharply. Your father would not leave important documents inaccessible. Maybe Mom has it, Daniel answered quietly. Then find out where she keeps it. I stopped beside the darkened dining room entrance and remained perfectly still. The study door was slightly open now, enough for light to spill across the hardwood floor. Through the narrow opening, I could see Vanessa standing beside Richard's desk wearing cream-colored silk pajamas beneath one of Daniel's sweaters. Her blonde hair was tied loosely back, and she held several folders against her chest while scanning the room with narrowed eyes. Not grieving. Searching. Daniel stood near the bookshelf looking exhausted and uncomfortable. I do not think we should be doing this, he murmured. Vanessa exhaled impatiently. Daniel, please stop acting naive. Your mother is emotional right now. People make irrational decisions after loss. Mom is not irrational. Everyone becomes irrational around money. The sentence hung in the air for several seconds. Daniel looked down without responding. I realized then that Vanessa did not even lower her voice out of guilt anymore. Only strategy. She already viewed herself as the most competent person in the family. Richard once warned me that arrogance becomes dangerous when mixed with patience. What exactly are you looking for? Daniel finally asked. Vanessa walked toward the filing cabinet beside the windows. Your father updated something recently. I know he did. How? Because he stopped including us in discussions. Her tone sharpened slightly now. 6 months ago, he removed me from the quarterly foundation meetings. Then he changed attorneys without telling us. I felt my chest tighten unexpectedly. Richard had hidden more than I realized. Vanessa tested one cabinet drawer after another before sighing in frustration. There are probably account structures we do not know about yet. Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. Vanessa, maybe we should wait until after the Memorial Week and let your mother start making decisions before we understand the situation. She turned toward him fully now. Daniel, listen to me carefully. Your father respected strength. If we sit back and do nothing, everything becomes vulnerable. Vulnerable. The words sounded rehearsed. Corporate. Vanessa always spoke about family relationships the way attorneys discuss mergers. I remained hidden beside the hallway entrance, listening quietly while rain tapped harder against the windows outside. Do you really think Dad changed the trust? Daniel asked softly. Vanessa hesitated just long enough to confirm my worst suspicion. I think your father knew exactly what he was doing. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Vanessa lowered her voice again. It means wealthy men do not spend 40 years building an empire just to leave it vulnerable to emotional decisions. Emotional decisions. By emotional, she meant me. The widow upstairs wearing her dead husband's sweater while his son and daughter-in-law searched his office before sunrise. I should have walked in then. Any reasonable person probably would have. But something inside me remained calm. Still, almost detached. Because Richard had prepared me for this moment more carefully than I understood at the time. For months before his death, we attended a charity gala in Manhattan hosted by one of Richard's longtime business partners. Vanessa spent nearly the entire evening networking aggressively with investors, while Daniel followed behind her carrying drinks and smiling politely at strangers. On the drive home afterward, Richard loosened his tie and stared quietly through the car window for several minutes before speaking. Have you noticed she never asks how people are feeling? He said suddenly. I looked up from my phone. What? Vanessa. He turned toward me slightly. She only asks what people are planning. At the time, I laughed softly because the comment sounded unnecessarily harsh. But Richard continued watching the city lights pass outside his window with the tired expression of a man finally accepting something painful. Some people see relationships as bridges, he said quietly. Others see them as ladders. Standing in the dark hallway now, listening to Vanessa discuss my husband's assets less than 24 hours after his funeral, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Inside the study, Vanessa opened another drawer before muttering something under her breath. There should be documentation somewhere. Daniel crossed his arms uneasily. Maybe Mom deserves a little time before we start talking about finances. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. And maybe your mother is counting on that hesitation. Daniel looked startled. What is that supposed to mean? Vanessa softened immediately, walking closer to him with practiced calm. I am saying grief changes people. We have to protect your future too. She touched his arm gently. Your father wanted this family secure. Secure. Another strategic word. Vanessa never spoke directly about money. She wrapped greed inside concern the same way expensive stores wrap ugly purchases in beautiful paper. Daniel looked unconvinced now, but not strong enough to challenge her completely. That was always Vanessa's advantage. She did not dominate people through force or cruelty. She exhausted them emotionally until agreement felt easier than resistance. We should go upstairs, Daniel said finally. It is late. Vanessa glanced around the study one last time before carefully returning several folders to the desk. Then she stopped suddenly. Her eyes narrowed toward the locked filing cabinet near the windows. The cabinet Richard gave me the brass key for. Slowly, Vanessa walked toward it and rested her fingers lightly against the top drawer. There, she whispered softly. That is what he protected. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Strange how clarity works. Once someone finally reveals themselves completely, fear disappears with disappointment. Vanessa crouched beside the cabinet and tested the lock carefully. Still locked. Still secure. Daniel shifted uncomfortably behind her. Come on, he murmured. Mom could wake up. Vanessa smiled faintly without looking at him. Trust me, she said softly. Your mother has no idea what your father was really protecting. I nearly laughed out loud hearing that sentence. Because upstairs inside my nightstand drawer rested the small velvet box containing the only thing standing between Vanessa Harper and $28 million. After several more moments, they finally turned off the study light and disappeared upstairs together. I waited until their footsteps faded completely before stepping quietly into Richard's office alone. The room still smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows overlooking the back lawn. I walked toward the filing cabinet slowly and rested my hand against the cold brass lock. Then I opened my sweater pocket and removed the key. Richard trusted me with this for a reason. Not because I was stronger than our son. Not because I understood finance better than Vanessa. But because after 40 years together, my husband knew something nobody else in this house understood yet. Silence can be a weapon when everyone around you mistakes it for weakness. The filing cabinet opened with a soft metallic click that sounded unnaturally loud inside the silent study. I froze for a moment afterward, listening carefully for footsteps upstairs, but the house remained still except for the rain brushing gently against the windows. Slowly, I pulled open the top drawer and stared down at the neatly organized folders resting inside. Richard always believed important things should be arranged clearly. Confusion is expensive, he used to say whenever Daniel complained about contracts or financial statements. Even now, after death, my husband remained methodical. Labels divided each section with precise handwriting. Property holdings, foundation accounts, investment trusts, legal protections. My fingers hesitated briefly over the final folder resting alone at the back of the drawer. Family Trust Revision, dated 6 months earlier. I carried the folder carefully to Richard's desk and sat in the leather chair where he had spent decades building the life surrounding us. The desk lamp cast a warm amber glow across the papers while rainwater slid slowly down the tall study windows behind me. For several seconds, I simply stared at Richard's signature across the top page. Strong. Steady. Familiar. Seeing his handwriting hurt more than the funeral. Funerals are performances. Paper feels personal. I opened the folder slowly. Legal documents filled the first several pages. Revised trust structures. Asset reallocations. Property authority clauses. Nearly everything had been transferred into a protected trust controlled entirely by me. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Me. I read each line carefully despite already knowing the general arrangement. Richard wanted me to understand every detail myself. Never let anyone summarize your own protection for you. He once told me after Vanessa attempted to explain one of our investment meetings to me like I was a child struggling to understand arithmetic. At the time, I laughed politely to avoid tension. Richard did not laugh. Buried halfway through the folder sat another document sealed separately inside a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front. Evelyn. Nothing else. My throat tightened unexpectedly as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter folded carefully in half. I recognized Richard's writing immediately. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I was right about 2 things. First, I did not have as much time as I hoped. Second, Vanessa wasted very little of it. I closed my eyes briefly before continuing. The room suddenly felt smaller around me. You always believed love naturally teaches people loyalty. I used to believe that too. But wealth changes weak people long before grief ever does. Daniel is not cruel, but he is easily led by anyone confident enough to make his decisions for him. And Vanessa has been making his decisions for years. I swallowed hard and kept reading. Over the last 18 months, I quietly tested several situations involving finances, property discussions, and family authority. Vanessa failed every one of them. She pushed Daniel to ask about asset transfers while I was in treatment. She attempted to gain access to foundation records through my assistant. She even asked whether your name remained on certain property deeds after my second surgery. My hands tightened slightly around the paper. Richard noticed everything. Every smile. Every carefully disguised question. Every manipulation I dismissed because I wanted peace inside our family. If she behaves honorably after my death, help Daniel rebuild his life with dignity. But if she begins circling this family like an acquisition, do not protect them from the consequences of their own greed. The final sentence sat alone at the bottom of the page beneath his signature. You spent 40 years protecting everyone else. It is time someone protected you. I stared at those words for a very long time. Upstairs, somewhere beyond the study ceiling, I heard a floorboard creak softly. Probably Daniel moving through the guest bedroom hallway. The same hallway where he used to race toy cars across the hardwood floors when he was 6 years old. Richard would pretend to complain about the noise while secretly buying him more cars every Christmas. There was a time our family felt simple, warm, real. I remember summer mornings when Daniel was little and Richard grilled pancakes on the back patio while our son chased fireflies through the gardens barefoot in pajamas. We were not wealthy then. Not truly. Richard was still building his investment firm from a small office above a pharmacy in Hartford. I taught piano lessons 3 afternoons a week while carefully budgeting grocery lists and school clothes. But back then, nobody measured love against inheritance percentages. Somewhere along the way, success entered this family quietly and rearranged everything without us noticing. Not all at once. Slowly. New neighborhoods, bigger homes, charity galas, private schools, conversations shifting from dreams to assets. Vanessa simply arrived after the transformation was already complete. Perhaps that was why Richard saw her more clearly than I did. He remembered who we were before money complicated people. A soft vibration interrupted my thoughts. Richard's cell phone, still resting inside the top desk drawer where hospital staff returned his personal belongings after he passed away. The screen illuminated with a text notification. Vanessa. For a second, I considered ignoring it entirely. Then slowly, I picked up the phone and looked down at the message glowing against the dark screen. Daniel says your mother mentioned arrangements. Did your father ever finalize the Greenwich property transfer? My chest tightened instantly. Not because of greed anymore. Because of timing. Richard had been dead less than 24 hours, and Vanessa was already discussing real estate transfers through his personal phone. There was another message immediately beneath it. We need clarity before Margaret Ellis gets involved. Margaret Ellis, Richard's attorney. Vanessa sounded nervous. That alone told me more than the message itself. I placed the phone carefully back inside the drawer and leaned slowly against the leather chair. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past 2 years rearranged themselves inside my memory with painful clarity. Vanessa asking whether Richard planned to retire completely after treatment. Vanessa insisting on hosting Thanksgiving inside our home to understand how everything functions. Vanessa offering to help organize paperwork after Richard's first surgery. At the time, I interpreted her behavior as ambitious, maybe even controlling, but not dangerous. Now I realize something far worse. Vanessa viewed tragedy as opportunity. A sudden knock sounded softly against the partially open study door. I looked up immediately. Margaret stood quietly in the hallway wearing a camel-colored wool coat damp from the rain outside. Her silver hair framed a calm, unreadable expression. I thought I might find you here, she said gently. I quickly folded Richard's letter closed. It is late. Margaret stepped inside and closed the door carefully behind her. I came because Richard asked me to check on something personally after the funeral. My eyes lifted toward her face. What kind of something? Margaret's expression remained neutral, but I noticed the subtle caution in her posture. Has Vanessa approached you about financial matters yet? I almost laughed from exhaustion. She and Daniel were searching this office before sunrise. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, like someone hearing confirmation of bad news she already expected. I was afraid of that. The rain outside intensified slightly, tapping harder against the windows. Margaret removed her gloves slowly before walking toward the desk. Evelyn, she said quietly, there are details within Richard's trust you still do not fully understand. A cold heaviness settled low in my stomach. What kind of details? Margaret hesitated only briefly. Your husband did not simply protect the estate from mismanagement. She looked directly at me then. He designed the trust to expose anyone attempting to manipulate the family after his death. For the first time since Richard died, I felt something stronger than grief begin rising quietly beneath my sadness. Not anger, not fear, clarity. Margaret remained standing beside Richard's desk, while rain continued sliding slowly down the windows behind her. The study felt smaller now, crowded with truths that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface of our family for years. I folded Richard's letter carefully and returned it to the envelope before looking back up at her. What exactly did Richard create? I asked softly. Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses from her coat pocket and placed a thin folder onto the desk between us. A conditional inheritance structure, she replied calmly. One designed to measure behavior after his death. I stared at her without speaking. Even after 40 years of marriage, Richard still found ways to surprise me. Margaret opened the folder slowly. 6 months ago, Richard amended nearly every major financial structure connected to the estate. Property holdings, investment distributions, family access rights, foundation authority. Her eyes lifted briefly toward me, including specific behavioral clauses. Behavioral clauses? She nodded once. Your husband believed people reveal their true character most clearly when they think power is shifting. Outside, thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the dark. Connecticut hills. Margaret adjusted her glasses and continued reading. If any family member attempts coercion, manipulation, intimidation, or inappropriate financial interference against the surviving spouse within 12 months following Richard Harper's death, their inheritance rights become immediately suspended pending trustee review. I blinked slowly. Suspended. Potentially eliminated entirely. My breath caught slightly. Not because of the money. Because Richard had predicted this so precisely. Margaret closed the folder gently. He did not make these changes impulsively, Evelyn. Richard documented concerns for nearly a year. I leaned back slowly in the leather chair, exhaustion pressing heavily behind my eyes now. Why did he never tell Daniel directly? Margaret's expression softened slightly. Because Richard still hoped your son would choose differently once the moment arrived. The moment arrived. Such careful language for the collapse of a family. I glanced toward the dark hallway outside the study. Upstairs, Daniel and Vanessa were likely asleep now beneath imported linen sheets in one of the guest suites, while Richard's legal trap quietly tightened around them downstairs. What happens now? I asked quietly. Margaret hesitated before answering. That depends entirely on them. Silence settled heavily between us. Finally, Margaret removed another document from the folder and slid it across the desk toward me. There is something else you should see. I lowered my eyes toward the paper. A list. Dates. Times. Notes written in Richard's handwriting. My chest tightened instantly. What is this? Your husband kept records. I scanned the page slowly. January 14th. Vanessa requested access to Greenwich property valuation during chemotherapy treatment. March 2nd. Daniel questioned account succession structures after dinner conversation initiated by Vanessa. April 27th. Vanessa suggested assisted living arrangements in case Evelyn struggles alone. My fingers tightened against the edge of the paper. Richard documented everything. Not angrily. Not emotionally. Carefully. Like a businessman preparing evidence before negotiations. He knew, I whispered. Margaret's voice remained calm. He suspected. Another line caught my attention farther down the page. June 18th. Vanessa referred to estate as future transition opportunity during lunch with Claire Benson. Witnessed personally. I closed my eyes briefly. Claire Benson, Vanessa's closest friend from Manhattan. A woman who treated charity events like auditions for reality television. I remembered that lunch vividly now. Vanessa invited Richard to join them unexpectedly after one of his medical appointments downtown. He returned unusually quiet afterward. When I asked if something was wrong, he only smiled tiredly and said he was beginning to understand people more clearly than he wanted to. Margaret removed her glasses slowly. Richard did not hate Vanessa, Evelyn. I looked up. Then why does this feel like preparation for war? Because your husband spent his life building things carefully. Companies, investments, a family. And toward the end, he realized someone viewed all of it as inventory waiting to be transferred. Inventory. The same word Richard used months earlier. I suddenly felt terribly tired. Grief alone was exhausting enough. But betrayal layered itself differently across the body. Colder. Sharper. Like carrying invisible weight inside your chest every time someone smiles at you kindly. Margaret checked her watch quietly. There will be a formal family meeting in 3 days, she said. Richard arranged it personally. I frowned slightly. What kind of meeting? A trust review. My stomach tightened again. Daniel does not know? Neither does Vanessa. Rain continued falling steadily outside, while the grandfather clock near the bookshelf ticked softly through the silence. Margaret gathered several documents back into the folder before pausing carefully. Evelyn, she said gently. Until then, I strongly recommend you say as little as possible. I almost smiled at that. I have been underestimated for 40 years because I prefer silence over conflict. Margaret's expression shifted faintly. Good. Keep letting them underestimate you. After she left, I remained inside the study alone for nearly another hour. The rain finally stopped sometime near dawn, leaving the windows fogged softly from the cold. I walked slowly around the room, touching familiar objects as if memorizing them differently now. Richard's fountain pen beside the desk calendar. The brass globe Daniel used to spin endlessly as a child. Framed photographs from vacations before our family became so cautious around one another. There was one picture from Cape Cod 20 years earlier where Daniel stood between Richard and me laughing openly, while Vanessa leaned against the railing beside him, smiling toward the ocean. She had just entered our lives then. Beautiful, charming, intelligent. Richard once admitted he admired her confidence at first. She reminds me of younger executives, he said after meeting her parents for dinner. Very ambitious. Ambition did not frighten Richard, but entitlement did. The difference took me years to recognize myself. By the time sunlight finally began filtering weakly through the clouds outside, I heard movement upstairs again. Cabinet doors opening. Footsteps crossing hardwood floors. Morning beginning. I locked the filing cabinet carefully and slipped the brass key back into my sweater pocket before leaving the study. The kitchen already smelled faintly of coffee when I entered. Vanessa stood near the marble island wearing cream-colored athletic clothes and expensive gold jewelry subtle enough to appear effortless. She looked polished despite sleeping barely a few hours after her father-in-law's funeral. Daniel sat quietly at the breakfast table staring into a mug of untouched coffee. Vanessa looked up immediately when I entered. "Evelyn," she said warmly. "I was just about to bring you breakfast upstairs." Of course she was. I moved calmly toward the coffee machine myself. "That is thoughtful." Vanessa studied my face carefully while I poured coffee into Richard's favorite white porcelain mug. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked gently. "A little. Grief affects everyone differently." She delivered the sentence with polished sympathy while sliding fresh fruit onto a plate for appearances neither of us believed anymore. Daniel glanced up briefly. His eyes looked swollen from exhaustion. Or guilt. Possibly both. "Mom," he said quietly. "Vanessa and I were thinking maybe we could help sort through Dad's paperwork later today." There it was again. The pressure disguised as support. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee before answering. "There is no rush." Vanessa smiled carefully. "Of course not. We just thought you should not carry all that responsibility yourself." Responsibility. Another strategic word. I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup and suddenly saw the entire situation with absolute clarity. Vanessa believed she was managing a fragile widow. Daniel believed avoiding conflict would somehow preserve the family. And neither of them understood that Richard spent the last year preparing for exactly this conversation. "Your father trusted Margaret Ellis with most legal matters," I said calmly. Vanessa's expression shifted almost invisibly, barely noticeable, but I saw it. Nervousness. "Margaret," she repeated lightly. "Yes." I sat down slowly across from them at the breakfast table Richard designed himself 15 years earlier. "She will handle everything." Daniel looked uncertain now. Vanessa recovered quickly, offering another polished smile. "That is probably for the best." But her fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup after she said it. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized something important. Vanessa Harper was no longer completely confident. The next 3 days unfolded. With the strange politeness wealthy families use when they are waiting for something important to happen. Nobody argued openly. Nobody raised their voice. But tension moved silently through the estate like smoke beneath a closed door. Vanessa became unusually attentive toward me after breakfast that morning. Too attentive. She insisted on handling phone calls from florists and caterers connected to the memorial service. She began referring to household staff schedules as if she already supervised them personally. Twice, I caught her walking through rooms with a small leather notebook in her hand, quietly writing things down. Measurements, furniture, art placements. Once, late Tuesday afternoon, I watched her stand alone inside the formal dining room staring thoughtfully at the oil painting above the fireplace Richard purchased during our anniversary trip to Florence 20 years ago. "It is probably worth a fortune," she murmured softly without realizing I stood in the doorway behind her. She turned quickly when she saw me, recovering almost instantly. "Evelyn," she said warmly, pressing one hand against her chest. "You startled me." I smiled faintly. Richard loved that painting. Vanessa glanced back toward it again. "It is beautiful," but she did not say meaningful, or sentimental, or personal. Beautiful meant valuable in Vanessa's vocabulary. Everything eventually translated into worth. I walked farther into the dining room slowly, my fingertips brushing the polished mahogany table Richard and I selected together the year Daniel left for college. The table could seat 16 comfortably, though most holidays lately felt emptier than the room itself. "Do you know," I said quietly, "Richard almost did not buy this house." Vanessa looked surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "He thought it was too large. Too expensive. He worried success might change people if we surrounded ourselves with too much luxury." Vanessa gave a small, amused laugh. "Well, he was obviously wrong. You built an extraordinary life here." I looked directly at her then. "Yes," I replied softly. "We did." Something flickered briefly across her expression before she looked away. Not guilt. Irritation. Because people like Vanessa dislike being reminded that wealth existed before they arrived to inherit it. That evening, Daniel attempted several awkward conversations with me about practical matters. Account access, property taxes, staff contracts. None of it sounded natural coming from him. My son used to discuss books with me, music, politics. Now every conversation felt edited by someone standing just outside the frame. "Vanessa thinks it might help if we create a transition plan," he said carefully during dinner Wednesday night. The three of us sat around the massive kitchen island while rain once again pressed softly against the windows overlooking the gardens. "Transition," I repeated calmly while cutting into grilled salmon I barely tasted. Daniel hesitated. "For the estate." Vanessa stepped in smoothly before silence became uncomfortable. "Only temporarily, Evelyn. There are simply so many responsibilities tied to a property this size." She gestured lightly around the kitchen. 11,000 square feet is a lot for one person. There it was again, the suggestion disguised as concern. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. "Your father and I managed it together for decades." Vanessa smiled sympathetically. "Exactly. Together." I noticed Daniel avoiding eye contact again. The old grandfather clock near the breakfast alcove ticked softly through the silence, while staff quietly cleared dishes in the background. Finally, Vanessa leaned slightly forward. "Have you thought any more about downsizing?" The audacity almost impressed me now. 3 days after burying my husband, and she was already discussing removing me from my own home over grilled salmon and imported wine. "No," I answered simply. Vanessa blinked once, clearly expecting something softer. "Well," she replied lightly, "there is no rush. We just want to make sure you are protected." Protected. Another strategic word. Richard once told me manipulators prefer language that sounds generous because it keeps other people feeling guilty for resisting them. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly before standing from the table. "Excuse me. I have a headache." Daniel looked genuinely concerned for a brief moment. "Mom, are you all right?" "Just tired." That part was true. Grief exhausted the body differently than physical labor ever could. It lived inside your muscles, your breathing, your heartbeat. Everything required effort now, even pretending not to see the quiet negotiations happening around me. Upstairs, I moved slowly through the bedroom, gathering laundry Richard never had the chance to wear again. His favorite gray sweater still smelled faintly of cedarwood cologne and winter air. I folded it carefully against my chest before placing it inside the cedar trunk at the foot of our bed. Sometimes I still expected him to walk through the bedroom door, carrying coffee and morning newspapers beneath one arm. 40 years of habit does not disappear in a week. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Margaret Ellis entered quietly after I answered. She wore another tailored wool coat, dark green this time, and carried a slim leather portfolio beneath one arm. "Tomorrow is confirmed," she said gently after closing the door behind her. I nodded once. "Will they know before the meeting starts?" No. Margaret placed the portfolio carefully onto the bed beside me. Richard wanted their behavior documented naturally beforehand. Naturally. Such a clinical word for betrayal. I sat slowly near the window while Margaret opened the portfolio. Inside were several additional documents I had not yet seen. Account summaries, property protections, trustee conditions. One page immediately caught my attention. Conditional disinheritance trigger events. My stomach tightened. Richard truly believed it would reach this point. Margaret remained quiet for a moment before answering. Toward the end, yes. She slid another paper toward me. He also added surveillance authorization within the estate. I frowned slightly. Surveillance. Security recordings. Margaret adjusted her glasses carefully. Richard upgraded the internal camera system after Vanessa began bringing contractors into the home during his treatments. I looked up sharply. Contractors? Margaret nodded once. Interior designers. Real estate consultants. Appraisers. Cold anger moved quietly through my chest for the first time since Richard died. Not explosive anger. Worse, controlled anger. The kind that settles into clarity. Without telling me, Margaret's expression softened with visible discomfort now. Richard intercepted most of it before you became aware. I stared out the rain-covered windows toward the dark gardens below. Vanessa had already been preparing to inherit this house while my husband was still fighting cancer inside hospital rooms. Suddenly, I remembered an evening nearly 8 months earlier when I returned unexpectedly from New York after visiting my sister. I found Vanessa standing inside the foyer with 2 strangers discussing lighting changes and staircase renovations. She smiled brightly when she saw me and explained they were just brainstorming future possibilities. At the time, I laughed politely because imagining someone redesigning my home while I still lived inside it seemed too absurd to take seriously. Richard did not laugh afterward. Never mistake boldness for harmlessness, he told me quietly later that night. Confident people usually reveal their intentions openly because they assume nobody will challenge them. Margaret closed the portfolio slowly. Tomorrow will determine everything. I looked toward her carefully. What exactly happens if Vanessa has already crossed those behavioral lines? Then, Richard's trustees activate the restriction clauses immediately. And Daniel? Margaret hesitated. That depends how involved he appears. The answer hurt more than I expected. Because despite everything, some foolish part of me still hoped my son would wake up before losing himself completely inside Vanessa's ambitions. Margaret stood quietly from the bed and gathered her portfolio. Before leaving, she paused near the bedroom door. Richard loved Daniel very much, she said softly, but he feared his kindness had made him weak. After she left, I remained seated beside the window long after darkness settled fully over the estate. Downstairs, faint music drifted from the kitchen where Vanessa and Daniel entertained 2 of their friends over wine as though grief had already become background decoration. I could hear Vanessa laughing occasionally beneath the soft jazz music. Light, carefree, victorious. Then, sometime near midnight, I heard her say something clearly enough from the upstairs hallway to stop me cold. Once the meeting is over tomorrow, she whispered confidently, everything changes. I stood silently inside the dark bedroom, listening while her heels clicked softly down the staircase below. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized something else with absolute certainty. Vanessa Harper did not merely expect to inherit this family's wealth. She already believed it belonged to her. The morning of the trust meeting arrived cold and painfully clear. Sunlight stretched across the estate in long pale ribbons, illuminating every polished surface inside the house with uncomfortable sharpness. The kind of autumn morning Richard loved. Crisp air, bare trees, silence before winter fully arrived. I stood alone beside the bedroom window watching fog lift slowly over the back gardens, while workers from the landscaping company cleared fallen leaves along the stone pathways below. Life continued moving with cruel efficiency, no matter who died. Downstairs, I could already hear Vanessa directing staff before 8 o'clock in the morning. Her heels crossed the marble foyer with quick confidence while she instructed Margaret, our housekeeper, to prepare the formal sitting room for guests. Use the silver tray set, she said calmly, and bring fresh orchids from the greenhouse. I closed my eyes briefly. The silver trays belonged to my mother. The orchids were Richard's favorite. Yet Vanessa spoke about both as if she had inherited authority over the estate already. A year ago, her confidence would have intimidated me. Today, it only made me sad. I dressed carefully that morning. Not elegantly. Intentionally. A navy wool dress Richard once told me made me look impossible to underestimate. Simple pearl earrings. Low heels. No dramatic widow's black. No fragile appearance inviting sympathy. When I finally descended the staircase shortly after 9, Vanessa paused mid-conversation inside the foyer and studied me carefully. She wore cream-colored trousers with a fitted cashmere sweater and enough gold jewelry to communicate wealth without appearing obvious. Vanessa never overdressed. She curated herself. "Evelyn," she said warmly, though I noticed her eyes briefly scanning my face for signs of weakness. You look wonderful considering everything. Considering everything. Such a polished way of saying considering your husband just died. Thank you, I replied calmly. Daniel stood near the fireplace, adjusting his tie nervously. He looked exhausted again. Pale. Distracted. I wondered if he slept at all last night, or if Vanessa spent hours rehearsing legal possibilities beside him in bed while his father's funeral flowers wilted downstairs. Margaret Ellis will arrive at 10. Vanessa continued smoothly. I thought it might be best if we all sat together beforehand and discussed expectations. Expectations. Another carefully selected word. I moved toward the coffee table slowly and poured myself tea without responding immediately. Silence unsettled Vanessa more than disagreement ever did because silence gave her nothing to manipulate. What kind of expectations? I asked finally. Vanessa smiled gently. Only practical matters. Estate transitions can become emotionally overwhelming if families are not aligned. Daniel nodded weakly beside her. Vanessa just means we should avoid confusion. Confusion. The same word Richard used for expensive mistakes. I lowered my teacup carefully onto the table. Your father already avoided confusion. Something shifted subtly across Vanessa's face. Tiny. Barely visible. But there. Anxiety. I am sure he did, she replied lightly. Still, there are always details families overlook during grief. I looked directly at her. Richard overlooked very little. The room fell quiet for several seconds. Somewhere deeper in the house, the grandfather clock chimed softly. Vanessa recovered first, offering another composed smile before turning toward Daniel. Maybe we should review the Greenwich property situation before Margaret arrives. There it was again. Greenwich. The waterfront property Richard purchased 20 years ago as an investment before turning it into a protected family asset under the trust. Vanessa mentioned that property more than any other, because unlike the estate, Greenwich could be sold quickly. Liquidity fascinated her. The Greenwich house? I asked softly. Vanessa nodded immediately. It probably makes sense to restructure ownership now. Restructure ownership. She said it so casually, as though rearranging decades of family assets should feel no more emotional than updating kitchen cabinets. Daniel shifted uncomfortably again. Vanessa thinks it would simplify taxes. Taxes. Another disguise. I picked up my teacup again slowly. Interesting. Vanessa leaned slightly closer. Of course, we would make sure you remained financially secure. There was that word again. Secure. Every sentence she spoke sounded like the introduction to a legal negotiation. Before I could respond, the front doorbell echoed through the foyer. Exactly 10 o'clock. Margaret Ellis entered moments later carrying a slim black briefcase and wearing a charcoal wool coat against the morning cold. Behind her walked another man I recognized immediately. Charles Whitmore, senior trustee for Harper Family Holdings. Richard trusted Charles for nearly 30 years. Vanessa's posture changed the second she saw him. More formal, more cautious. Charles, she said brightly, stepping forward with both hands extended. I had no idea you would be joining us. Charles shook her hand politely, but without warmth. Richard requested my presence personally. I noticed Vanessa glance quickly toward Daniel before recovering her smile again. Margaret removed her gloves calmly. We should begin in the library. The library had always been Richard's favorite room inside the estate. Floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves. Leather chairs facing the fireplace. Large windows overlooking the east gardens where he used to drink coffee every Sunday morning while reading financial journals and classical history books. Entering that room without him waiting inside felt unnatural. We took our seats quietly around the long conference table near the windows. Margaret sat at one end beside Charles Whitmore, while Vanessa positioned herself directly beside Daniel across from me. Strategic placement again. United front. Margaret opened her briefcase carefully and removed several folders. Before we begin, she said calmly, I would like to remind everyone that Richard Harper personally structured today's meeting and determined all legal conditions prior to his passing. Vanessa folded her hands elegantly atop the table. Of course, Margaret continued. The Harper Family Trust underwent substantial revisions 6 months ago. There it was. I watched Vanessa carefully as those words landed. Her smile remained intact, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. Daniel looked confused immediately. Revisions? He asked. Margaret nodded once. Yes. Charles. Whitmore opened another folder slowly beside her. Your father implemented a behavioral inheritance structure connected to all major family assets. Silence settled heavily across the room. Daniel frowned. Behavioral? Vanessa spoke before anyone else could answer. I am sorry, she said lightly, but I do not understand what that means. Margaret looked directly at her. It means inheritance access depends not only on blood relation, but also conduct following Richard Harper's death. Vanessa blinked once. Conduct. Charles finally spoke for the first time. His voice remained calm, but firm. Richard became concerned certain family members viewed his illness as a financial transition opportunity. The air inside the library changed instantly. Not loudly, quietly, like pressure shifting before a storm. Daniel looked stunned. Vanessa did not. She looked alert, calculating. Surely there is some misunderstanding, she replied smoothly. Margaret slid several documents across the table toward them. Security records, witness statements, financial inquiries, and documented attempts to influence estate decisions have already been reviewed. Daniel stared down at the papers in visible confusion. Vanessa did not touch them immediately. For the first time since Richard died, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not emotional. Careful. Dangerous people become quiet when they realize the room contains more information than they expected. What exactly are you implying? Vanessa asked softly. Charles Whitmore met her gaze directly. Nothing. He paused briefly. Richard documented everything himself. I watched the color shift subtly from Vanessa's face while morning sunlight spilled across the library shelves behind her. And suddenly I understood why Richard designed the trust this way. Not merely to protect money. To force truth into the open where nobody could hide behind politeness anymore. For several long seconds, nobody inside the library moved. Morning sunlight stretched across the polished conference table while the grandfather clock near the fireplace ticked softly through the silence. Daniel stared down at the folders in front of him as though the pages might rearrange themselves into something less painful if he waited long enough. Vanessa remained perfectly still beside him, one hand resting lightly against the leather armrest of her chair. Calm, controlled. But I noticed something different now. Her eyes were moving faster, calculating, searching for weaknesses inside information she no longer controlled. Charles Whitmore folded his hands neatly together atop the table. Richard Harper spent the last year restructuring the estate to ensure all transfers reflected loyalty rather than entitlement. Vanessa finally looked up. That is a very serious accusation, she said softly. Her voice remained smooth, but the warmth had disappeared completely. Margaret Ellis opened another folder beside her. No accusations are being made. Only conditions explained. Daniel looked toward me suddenly. Mom, did you know about this? There it was. Hurt. Confusion. The small, wounded expression of a little boy who still wanted someone else to explain why the world suddenly felt unsafe. I answered honestly. Your father discussed some concerns with me before he died. Daniel looked stunned. And you did not tell us? Vanessa spoke before I could answer. Of course she did not. Her tone remained polite, but bitterness slipped beneath the surface now, like broken glass beneath water. This was obviously coordinated. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. Be careful, Vanessa. Vanessa gave a short, humorless laugh. I am simply trying to understand why I am sitting in a room being treated like a criminal because I asked practical questions after my father-in-law died. Charles Whitmore slid another document across the table. You asked those practical questions while Richard Harper was still alive. Vanessa's jaw tightened. Barely, but enough. Daniel picked up the paper slowly. His eyes moved across several paragraphs before his face drained of color. What is this? He whispered. Margaret answered calmly. Security transcripts. Daniel looked back down immediately. I watched his breathing change as he continued reading silently. Then suddenly he stopped. Vanessa, she did not look at him. Context matters. Charles remained expressionless. You referred to Evelyn Harper as temporary emotional resistance during a recorded conversation with a real estate consultant. Silence. Cold and absolute. Daniel slowly lowered the paper. You said that. Vanessa finally turned toward him sharply. I was discussing logistics, not emotions. You called my mother resistance. Her composure slipped slightly then. Not dramatically, just enough for frustration to show beneath the polished surface. Because your father refused to make practical preparations, Daniel. Somebody had to think ahead. Think ahead. That was how Vanessa justified everything. Not greed. Efficiency. not manipulation. Planning. Richard once told me dangerous people rarely view themselves as villains. They simply believe everyone else is standing in the way of what they deserve. Margaret opened another folder quietly. There is also the matter of unauthorized contractor access to the estate during Richard's medical treatment. Vanessa crossed her arms slowly now. Defensive. I brought in interior consultants. Without permission. I was trying to help modernize the property. Charles Whitmore looked directly at her. While the owner was receiving chemotherapy, the words landed harder than anyone expected. Even Daniel looked physically uncomfortable hearing them spoken aloud. Vanessa inhaled slowly before responding. Richard knew I cared about this family's future. You cared about ownership, Charles replied calmly. Daniel pushed back slightly from the table. Stop. His voice sounded strained now. Everybody just stop for a second. He rubbed both hands across his face before looking toward me again. Mom, did Dad really believe we would try to take advantage of you? The question hurt more than anything else that morning because beneath it sat another truth neither of us wanted to say aloud. Richard did not fear Daniel nearly as much as he feared Daniel's weakness. Your father worried grief would cloud judgment, I answered quietly. Vanessa laughed softly again, though this time the sound carried sharp edges. That is convenient. Margaret looked at her steadily. Richard Harper personally signed every clause within this trust while fully evaluated by legal and medical professionals. Vanessa turned toward me then, directly, fully. The performance was beginning to crack now. So what exactly happens? She asked quietly. Do you control everything now? There was at last. No more concern about family harmony. No more soft language about protection or transitions. Just the question she had wanted answered from the beginning. Money, authority, control. I folded my hands carefully in my lap before answering. Richard created a 12-month behavioral review period. Vanessa stared at me. Meaning? Charles Whitmore responded before I could. Meaning no permanent inheritance distributions occur until trustee evaluations conclude. Daniel frowned immediately. A year. Margaret nodded once. During that time, all major assets remain under protected trust management controlled solely by Evelyn Harper. Solely. The word changed the room instantly. Vanessa's expression froze completely for one brief second before she recovered herself again. But I saw it. Shock. Real shock. Because for the first time since Richard died, Vanessa understood she was not negotiating with a grieving widow anymore. She was confronting the legal structure of an empire her husband built without trusting her inside it. That is absurd, she said softly. Richard would never cut Daniel out. Daniel is not cut out, Margaret replied calmly. Conditional access remains available depending on conduct. Vanessa looked toward Daniel. Quickly. This is manipulation. But Daniel no longer looked certain. He looked tired, lost, like a man slowly realizing the ground beneath him shifted long before today. Charles Whitmore opened one final folder. There is also an additional clause relevant to estate residency. Vanessa's attention snapped toward him instantly. Residency. Charles adjusted his glasses slightly. Only Evelyn Harper maintains automatic lifetime residential authority over this property. Silence. Then Margaret continued carefully. No secondary family member may establish permanent occupancy, redesign authority, or ownership transition activity without trustee approval during the review period. I watched the realization settle slowly across Vanessa's face. No renovations. No restructuring. No quiet takeover while I grieved upstairs alone. Richard had blocked every path she expected to use. You cannot seriously expect us to put our lives on hold for a year, Vanessa said tightly. Charles looked unmoved. Richard expected patience from people who genuinely loved this family. That sentence landed like a door quietly closing. Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair and walked toward the windows overlooking the East Gardens. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass beside bare autumn trees and gray skies. For several moments, she said nothing at all. Then finally she spoke without turning around. He never trusted me. Nobody answered immediately. Because the truth was sitting visibly between all of us now. Richard trusted actions more than charm. And Vanessa spent years performing loyalty while quietly planning inheritance logistics behind his back. Daniel stood slowly from his chair. Vanessa, but she lifted one hand slightly, stopping him. No, she said quietly. I understand now. She finally turned back toward the room, And for the first time since I met her 12 years earlier, the polished warmth had vanished completely from her face. What remained underneath was colder, sharper, ambition stripped of performance. Richard spent the last year building a cage around this family, she said softly. Charles Whitmore remained perfectly calm. No, he paused briefly. He built a mirror. And sitting there beneath the pale morning sunlight inside the library Richard loved most, I watched my daughter-in-law realize she had finally been seen clearly. After the meeting ended, the estate felt colder than before. Not quieter, colder. Like something invisible had finally cracked open inside the walls and could no longer be hidden beneath polished manners and expensive furniture. Vanessa disappeared upstairs almost immediately without speaking to anyone further. Her heels struck sharply against the staircase with none of the soft elegance she usually performed around guests. Daniel remained behind inside the library long after Charles Whitmore and Margaret Ellis gathered their papers and left. He sat motionless near the fireplace, staring at the folders spread across the conference table while pale afternoon sunlight drifted slowly across the room. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. I stood near the bookshelves, touching the spine of one of Richard's old history volumes, while watching my son struggle quietly with the collapse of the world he thought he understood. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. Dad really believed she was manipulating us. I looked toward him carefully. Your father believed people reveal themselves through patterns. Daniel laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Only exhaustion. Vanessa is ambitious. That does not make her evil. I said nothing. Because grief teaches you an important lesson very quickly. Silence often forces people to continue talking long enough to reveal what they actually fear. Daniel rubbed his hands across his face again. Mom, did you know about the recordings? Not all of them. He shook his head slowly. I cannot believe Dad was documenting conversations like some kind of investigation. Investigation. Such an innocent word for preparation. I walked slowly toward the window overlooking the east gardens where Richard planted white hydrangeas the year we moved into this house. Most of them were bare now beneath the October cold. Your father was frightened, I said quietly. Daniel frowned immediately. Of Vanessa? Of losing this family before he was gone. That answer silenced him. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees while landscapers finished clearing leaves along the stone pathways. The ordinary rhythm of the estate continued despite the emotional wreckage sitting quietly inside the library. Daniel stood slowly from his chair. I need some air. He left without waiting for my response. Through the tall windows, I watched him walk alone across the back terrace with his coat unbuttoned against the cold, shoulders slumped like a man carrying something heavier than grief. I wanted to follow him. I wanted to ask him whether he still remembered who he was before Vanessa taught him to measure life through strategy and appearances. But motherhood becomes complicated once your children are old enough to betray themselves willingly. That evening, Vanessa did not join us for dinner. Margaret quietly informed me she requested trays be sent upstairs to the guest suite instead. Daniel barely touched his food. He answered questions absently and spent most of the meal staring down at his wine glass, while rain once again gathered softly against the windows outside. Finally, halfway through dinner, he looked up suddenly. Mom, was Dad unhappy near the end? The question caught me off guard. Why would you ask that? Daniel hesitated. Because all of this feels planned. Planned. The word echoed strangely inside the empty dining room. Your father loved you, I answered carefully. Very much. Daniel swallowed hard. That is not what I asked. Silence stretched between us. I folded my napkin slowly beside my untouched plate before speaking again. Richard was disappointed, I admitted quietly. Daniel looked down immediately. In me? I stared at my son for a long moment. 41 years old. Gray beginning to appear near his temples. Expensive watch on his wrist. But underneath all of it, I still saw traces of the little boy who used to cry when injured birds fell from nests near the garden. Your father believed kindness should create character, I said softly. Toward the end, he worried comfort had created dependence instead. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Vanessa says he never respected her. There it was. Not his own opinion. Vanessa says. Always Vanessa says. I suddenly realized my son had not spoken an original thought all evening. Your father respected honesty, I replied. Daniel pushed back from the table abruptly and stood. You think she married me for money. I think your father noticed behavior patterns neither of us wanted to confront. Daniel gave a bitter laugh under his breath. Convenient timing now that you control everything. The sentence landed harder than he intended. I saw regret flash briefly across his face immediately afterward, but exhaustion kept him from apologizing. I never asked for control, I said quietly. Neither did your father. Daniel looked away. I need some sleep. He disappeared upstairs moments later, leaving me alone inside the dining room surrounded by silver candle holders and untouched food growing cold beneath soft lighting. Somewhere above me, a door closed sharply. Vanessa. I remained seated long after staff quietly cleared the dishes away. The estate no longer felt like home tonight. It felt divided. Later, sometime near midnight, I walked downstairs toward the kitchen for tea and noticed faint light spilling beneath the door of the downstairs sitting room near the west wing. Voices drifted softly through the partially open doorway. Vanessa and someone else. I moved quietly down the hallway without making a sound. You promised me this would be simple, Vanessa whispered sharply. Claire Benson answered from inside the room. How was anyone supposed to know Richard turned inheritance into a psychological experiment? I stopped beside the doorway unseen. Claire sat curled elegantly on one of the velvet chairs holding a wine glass, while Vanessa paced near the fireplace, still wearing fitted cream trousers and a silk blouse despite the late hour. Her composure from earlier was gone now. This changes everything, Vanessa muttered. A year under trustee review? She controls all distributions. Claire frowned. Can Daniel challenge it? Vanessa stopped pacing. Not without looking exactly like what Richard accused us of being. Us. Not him. Us. Claire lowered her voice carefully. Then maybe you need patience. Vanessa laughed softly, but the sound carried frustration now. You do not understand. Daniel already started questioning me after the meeting. She crossed her arms tightly. If I lose control of this situation now, everything falls apart. Everything. The word lingered heavily in the air. Claire studied her quietly. How bad are things financially? My heartbeat slowed instantly. Vanessa looked away toward the dark windows. The Manhattan condo refinancing is already stretched. Claire's expression changed. Wait, Daniel does not know? Vanessa gave another humorless laugh. Daniel barely understands half our accounts. Cold realization settled slowly through me. Richard was right. This was never simply greed. It was desperation wrapped inside ambition. Claire set down her wine glass carefully. How much debt? Vanessa hesitated. Almost $2 million between the condo, investment losses, and Daniel's partnership buy-in. I felt the air leave my lungs silently. $2 million. Suddenly, every rushed conversation about transitions and restructuring made horrifying sense. Vanessa was not merely planning for inheritance someday. She needed immediate access to wealth before their own life collapsed beneath them. If the trustees freeze distributions for a year, we are exposed, Vanessa whispered. Exposed. Not grieving. Not devastated. Exposed. Claire leaned forward carefully. Then you need Daniel fully on your side before his mother turns him against you. Vanessa's expression hardened. Evelyn already has. I stepped back silently from the doorway before either woman noticed me standing there. My tea. Forgotten entirely now. Upstairs, alone inside the dark hallway outside our bedroom, I rested one hand against the wall to steady myself. Richard did not merely protect me from manipulation. He protected Daniel from financial ruin he did not even fully understand yet. And somewhere downstairs beneath soft lamplight and expensive wine, my daughter-in-law was no longer planning inheritance. She was trying to survive.